On May 7th, 2020, Microsoft kicked off the new generation of consoles with a gameplay showcase featuring a range of games planned for release on Xbox Series X, and Bright Memory Infinite was the very first game shown off during this presentation, an honor reserved for precious few games throughout the history of game consoles. And now, more than 2 years later, or half a year after the arrival of the PC version, Bright Memory Infinite has finally arrived on console. Given its prominent placement in that original Xbox showcase, I felt that we needed to check it out here on Digital Foundry. So Bright Memory Infinite is a fast-paced first-person shooter which combines snappy gunplay with sword-driven melee combat. It's not a long game, but what's here is surprisingly solid and well executed. It almost recalls the 2013 reboot of Shadow Warrior in terms of pacing, though with more focused, linear level design. Plus, if you're playing on two of the latest consoles, Bright Memory Infinite also promises support for 120Hz output and ray-traced reflections. But where it surprises the most perhaps is in its development history. Bright Memory Infinite is a showpiece title for what modern development tools can offer when in the right hands. You see, most of the development duties on this game were executed by one person. In creating the game, Infinite was built using Unreal Engine 4 with additional support software and Quixel assets to help speed up development time. That's not to say this is entirely a solo project. Artists, musicians, voice actors, and more were all required to complete the game, but considering the quality of the presentation, it's an impressive accomplishment all the same. And in an unexpected twist, Bright Memory Infinite has released on Xbox Series X, Series S, PlayStation 5, and Nintendo Switch. That's right, while it does not support the last generation Xbox One or PlayStation 4 consoles, a port was developed for the Switch, making this an even more interesting proposition. So today we'll discuss the game's visual features, including its support for ray-traced reflections, examine each version of the game, and gauge its performance. So let's get into it. Straight away, Bright Memory Infinite's aesthetic is eye-catching. The Chinese influence is strong throughout, which, when combined with the high-tech weaponry, makes a strong impression. The blowing trees, stormy seas, and ruined temples fill the landscape before the player, and encounters often feel like a mix between first-person shooting and a third-person character action game. When comparing against the PC version though, it's clear that the settings have been scaled back dramatically, especially in regard to ray tracing. The PC version includes NVIDIA's Restir global illumination technology, allowing for more realistic bounce lighting. It features ray-traced ambient occlusion and shadows, and far more robust ray-traced reflections compared to the console version. The GI difference is most evident in areas like this. Note the light leaks visible on console, leading to unrealistic highlights. The PC version avoids this entirely. Lighting within interior spaces benefits tremendously from this feature, though I would argue the game still looks perfectly good without it. Environments also receive additional detail. Note the ground in this sequence, which features more visually dense terrain compared to the console version. But it's in the ray-traced reflections where we see the most significant difference. The PC version features dramatically higher resolution reflections, and more surfaces, including rougher materials, take advantage of them. Even in scenes with obvious puddles like this, the console version lacks the high-resolution, accurate reflections we see available on PC. Of course, in the same scene, there are some other changes in the favor of the console version, such as expanded foliage. There's a greater density visible in the bamboo stalks. But by and large, the PC version has an advantage. Beyond this, the PC version also supports NVIDIA's DLSS, which helps solve some of the image quality complaints I have in the console version, such as ghosting from the TAA. Still, while the differences are certainly vast on paper, I still feel the console version looks pretty good on its own terms. Of course, features such as ray tracing are only available if you're playing specific versions of the game, so let's cut right to the chase, shall we? If you're wondering which version to play, let me lay it out for you right here, and then I'll explain the details after that. When looking at technical performance and image quality then, the order is simple. Xbox Series X is on top, followed by PlayStation 5. Xbox Series S trails behind both, while predictably, the Switch brings up the tail end. That's not to say all versions don't have their positives, of course, so let's break it down. When it comes to high-end features, only Xbox Series X and PlayStation 5 receive support for ray traced reflections and 120 frames per second output. Ray tracing features are limited to reflections in this version of the game, and the resolution of these reflections is relatively low, but it is a match between both machines. Compared to SSR, the RT reflections do improve image quality significantly, primarily due to the sheer amount of water present in this game. You'll spend a lot of time running through rivers and lakes, and the RT implementation, while not perfect, does eliminate these typical SSR artifacts. That being said, the BVH structure used as the source for the reflection does not include everything within the scene. Some geometry is missing, and things such as particles, like fire, are completely absent as well. So there are drawbacks to using this feature. Alright, so let's talk image quality. Xbox Series X, as mentioned earlier, comes out on top, with both the default mode and the ray tracing mode targeting full 2160p, and surprisingly, the resolution appears to hold most of the time. Now, PlayStation 5 also targets this resolution, but it seems to dip below 4K more often, leading to a slight loss in overall clarity if you look closely. The more significant difference appears when using the game's high frame rate mode. Here, Xbox Series X appears to stick primarily to its 1440p target, while the PS5 can often drop to around 80% of this value, leading to a further loss in clarity when using the high frame rate mode. Xbox Series S and Switch in comparison both feature just one single display mode, but at least all of these versions do allow for full adjustment of the FOV and motion blur, which is nice. In terms of resolution, Xbox Series S targets 1440p, but in most cases, you'll find that the resolution dips between 80 to 90% of 1440p. Last then, there's the Switch, which aims for 1080p and 720p when in docked and portable modes, respectively, but it typically falls to around 80% of these targets during our random samples. It is sharper than your typical Unreal-based Switch game, however, that much I can say. So yeah, Xbox Series X and PS5 offer the same modes with the same visual settings, with Xbox having an image quality advantage. The Series S then is reduced in terms of features, but matches the default mode available on more powerful consoles. Switch, however, is its own thing entirely, and in that sense, this Switch version is immensely fascinating in terms of its visual makeup. Major sacrifices were required to pull this game off on Nintendo's portable machine. And this is one of the reasons why I enjoy covering Nintendo Switch so much these days. I love seeing how developers squeeze the most out of a platform like the Switch. So right from the game's introduction, it's clear that many of the cinematic effects, such as the depth of field, are scaled way back on Switch. Numerous lights are culled from the scene, textures are lower resolution, and everything appears to be somewhat simplified. When we jump over to the next sequence in the cockpit, the out-of-focus area around the ship resolves to a very low resolution with extremely visible pixelation throughout on the Switch. Furthermore, the small buttons adorning the control panel become illegible on Switch due to the decrease in texture quality and resolution. Even the grid pattern visible across the ship's control panel is all but invisible on the Switch. That said, the scene itself does manage to retain much of its visual identity, and it plays out smoothly too. Well, at least as smooth as 30 frames per second can be anyways. Once we reach the first mission though, more cutbacks are evident. The underwater distortion effect is completely absent. Motion blur is only active on a selective basis. Note how it's actually missing in this scene here, but it is actually active during much of the gameplay. And of course, overall scene complexity is pared back as well, and things like animation and particles are all reduced. So basically, throughout the experience, these differences represent most of what you'll find. All of the settings are scaled way back beyond even the lowest possible options available on PC. Textures, reflections, foliage, lighting, particles, and more are all reduced. And yeah, if you look at the comparison directly, it all seems rather dire, doesn't it? Yet when you're actually playing the game in portable mode, especially on a Switch OLED, it feels a lot more solid than you'd expect. Image quality is sharper than usual, performance feels reasonably consistent, though we'll look at that in more detail shortly. And things like motion blur are retained during most of the game's sequences, though of course that is optional. It's both vastly inferior to all other versions of the game, yet still surprisingly very playable and impressive given the hardware limitations of the Switch itself. How's that for a paradox? So what about performance then? Let's start at the top with Xbox Series X. This is the best performing version of the bunch. In its default mode, results are uneventful. It's exceptionally stable, save for the occasional single frame blips appearing along the frame time graph, and that's pretty much true from the game's introduction through its ending. Now when ray tracing is enabled, performance remains surprisingly nearly as good. Most sequences throughout the game manage to reach and maintain 60 frames per second, just as in the default mode. During normal play, however, you will notice some additional hiccups compared to that mode, and I also found that during certain other segments, more significant drops could appear as well. That said, while the RT reflections are pared back compared to the PC version, it's still impressive that the game runs at effectively native 4K at 60 frames per second with ray traced reflections. But then we have the 120Hz mode, and this is even more surprising. It's extremely stable. Yes, the same occasional hiccups do occur, but it's effectively a rock-solid 120 frames per second, making for a very responsive game that looks fantastic in motion. This is definitely my preferred way to play. And this brings us to PS5. So the normal and ray tracing modes are extremely similar to the Xbox version in terms of performance, both delivering 60 frames per second most of the time with only minor hiccups, though it does tend to run at a slightly lower resolution. Heavier scenes can drop occasionally in the ray tracing mode, of course, but overall, it's perfectly fine. It's in the 120Hz mode where issues begin to pop up on PlayStation 5, however. So firstly, before you even get into the game, you'll need to pop over to the PS5 system settings and select this option. If you do not do this, the game will not trigger 120Hz output. You can still enable the high frame rate mode from the menu if you like, but you won't actually benefit from it unless you take this step. But even once you do take that step, things are not perfect. Essentially, the PS5 version is unable to retain its 120 frames per second target during normal gameplay, and it regularly falls below this point, as you can see on the graph results presented here. This leads to a less consistent experience all around. Now, of course, you can overcome this if you have a VRR display, but in terms of raw performance numbers, it is lower. Now, also worth noting is that this game does include the option to disable vertical sync, but I would never recommend it. It produces constant screen tearing and looks absolutely horrific as a result. In fact, it's only reserved for those in search of the absolute lowest possible input latency at the expense of everything else. It does, however, allow the frame rate to go above 60, apparently, when using the high frame rate mode with VSync off on a 60Hz display, but again, it looks terrible in motion. So what about the other two versions then? Well, Xbox Series S performs well, basically equivalent to its bigger brother in the standard mode, but with a significant decrease in resolution. It is a mostly stable 60 frames per second based on my experience. It's perfectly serviceable on the Series S. Switch, however, is unfortunately not where it should be. I mentioned earlier that it was smooth, but that's only true to a certain extent in that it maintains 30 frames per second most of the time. But unfortunately, our old nemesis, incorrect frame pacing, makes a triumphant return with the sole intent to spoil your day by negatively impacting frame persistence. Thus, in its current form, this is an issue to be aware of when considering the game on Switch, and yes, it occurs in both portable and docked modes. Beyond the performance, however, I also encountered some occasional bugs. One time, during normal play, the game crashed back to the dashboard, forcing me to restart from a prior checkpoint. Another time, when using the quick resume function of the Xbox, the game started up running at 30 frames per second. I had to jump into the options menu, toggle one of the settings, and then return to the game to fix it, though I'm sure restarting the game would have also accomplished the same goal. Strange either way. Then there were situations like this where you'll catch a glimpse of a foe just prior to their entry animation, which appears glitchy, or moments where the AI finds themselves lodged between bamboo stalks, allowing you to effectively pick them off. So where does that leave Bright Memory Infinite? Well, that's tricky and requires the full context of what this game is to really appreciate it. As a work primarily created by a single person, Bright Memory Infinite is inspiring. It channels the uncanny valley concept, but applied to AAA game development. It aspires to deliver a AAA experience, and even looks and feels much like a AAA shooter might, at least in some respects. But it doesn't quite pull it off, which is okay, honestly, if you ask me. It's a darned fun first-person shoot-stab of a good time. It's also a brisk game, clocking in at under 2 hours. It cost $20, yet its developer spent years of his life working to create it. Was it worth it? Well, that's not something I can answer, but it is something to consider when consuming your next video game, especially if your next video game happens to have been created by a small team or even an individual. What I will say here is that the developer did a fine job of creating a simple, streamlined little game, and if it looks like fun to you, maybe it's worth checking out. Either way, it'll always have that legacy of being one of the very first games shown for the next generation of consoles, even if it arrived more than 2 years after that initial showing. But that's gonna do it for this little video, so hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you next time.